Thank you, Chairman. Well, the answer is yes, it can help plug the gap, but eventually, because the whole nuclear program has slowed down. Nevertheless, it is considerable. There are 460 nuclear reactors around the world, and it provides about 16% of world electricity, which is about the same as large-scale hydro. And at the moment, nuclear saves emissions of CO2 annually of about 2.5 billion tonnes. If you doubled the nuclear component, it would reduce CO2 emissions from power generation by a quarter. In other words, it does make a considerable contribution, and it could make an even bigger contribution. And if you just take France, no, let's take Europe. If you take Europe and you said, no, we'll, as Germany has done, we'll abandon nuclear power. If you did that, in order to maintain the status quo in terms of CO2 emissions, you would have to take 80% of the cars off the roads in Europe. In other words, that's the kind of contribution that nuclear power makes, which is much, much, much bigger than all the renewables we talked about yesterday, which hardly appear in the statistics. And now, in the UK, nuclear provided about 18% of our electricity last year. It was 22% in 2002. It's declining because our nuclear reactors are coming to the end of their lives and being decommissioned. Interesting little point about Calder Hall, which is the first nuclear reactor, the first commercial nuclear reactor in the world. In 1953, we published a white paper in the UK saying that we were going to develop atomic energy, as it was called in those days, in two streams, one via the breeder route and the other straightforward thermal reactors. 1953. 1956, we built it, it was up and running, and the Queen opened it, which shows what engineers can do if they're given their head. As soon as they're hedged around by bureaucrats and the like, it now takes 10 years to do that, with a design you've already got. So I have to say things have gone downhill. And of course in 1956, the UK led the world in developing its nuclear technology, but it's faltered a bit since then. Now, one point I want to make, and I expect you'll argue about it, is that we live in quite difficult times now, and that there are two things. One, we want a secure supply of reasonably priced energy, and the other is, of course, we want to stop climate change running away as a result of the greenhouse effect. You have to put security before climate change. Lots of people would say the opposite. But if you don't have a secure supply, if you start getting blackouts or brownouts, as they're euphemistically called, well then, you are in real trouble. Your economy nosedived. Give you one idea. Remember, we had a lot of blackouts in 2003, right across America and Europe and into Scandinavia. We had a blackout of 12 hours in London, and the consequential financial loss was in London was £700 million. Nothing worked. The stock exchange didn't work. None of your computers would work. It was disastrous. And the same thing happened in New York, and the consequential loss there was $2 billion, again, for an outage of about 12 hours. So that really is an imperative, and you have to take that on board. Let me tell you what happens when you have a power cut in a supermarket. I had to examine a Cambridge PhD for a girl who'd actually studied this topic, what happens when you have blackouts in supermarkets in East Anglia. I don't believe East Anglia is any different from anywhere else. Well, the answer is they pinch everything off the shelves within about 3 minutes. And I know it might seem, I thought it was unlikely, but I had a meeting with some very ferocious lady magistrates on one occasion, and I put that question to them: what do you think happens? Theft, they said. That's what happens. And so you see, civilization is pretty thin. It spirals down in about 3 minutes to anarchy. so that it is absolutely essential that you have a secure supply of electricity. Now, let's just look at where our electricity comes from. As I said, 18% is nuclear, 46% is gas and rising, and 28% is coal. We still burn a lot. In fact, coal generates more electricity worldwide than any other fuel. And in the UK, well, wind, 2.7%. Biomass, 3.4%. 1% hydro. The renewables are about 7%. The subsidy on those renewables, that's which attract ROCs, is last year was £1.4 billion, as I think I mentioned yesterday. If you project forwards with the plans that we have for renewables, then that will be £39 billion by 2020, which we cannot possibly afford. Hence, cutting back now on all sorts of things, feed-in tariffs and the like. And there's no chance of meeting the 2020 target, despite what secretaries of state say, people of that kind, who unfortunately can't do arithmetic. In fact, I've toyed with the idea of holding remedial arithmetic lessons for ministers, but I don't suppose they would pay to come to them, because they never pay to come to anything. What about the future as far as nuclear is concerned? I'm assuming that we go ahead in Europe and elsewhere. Elsewhere, of course, Chinese are currently building 19 nuclear power stations. So if we go ahead with nuclear, and I think we're in real trouble if we don't, the next round of stations, which will come in about 2030, will be breeder reactors, the so-called Generation 4 reactors, all designed, all tested in all sorts of ways, but they won't be up and running until 2030. And they will be breeder reactors, that is, they use uranium about 60 times more efficiently than we do in thermal reactors. The Russians have proceeded now. I had some meetings with the Russians in 2001, and they are under no illusions. They say, as far as we're concerned, despite all the oil and gas that we have, the future has to be an ever-increasing nuclear component. And they've pursued breeder reactors. They've been running in Russia since, for about 30 years now. Well, interestingly enough, they have a fast breeder reactor in Kazakhstan, which does two things. It generates electricity and it desalinates water. And in fact, a nuclear station is curiously appropriate for a water desalination plant to be alongside it. And I think probably water shortages will turn out to be even more serious than power shortages.
Yeah, what percentage of electricity in Russia is provided by fast breeders?
I think there are 3 at the moment. They're not huge, about 800 megawatts, that sort of thing.
What is the percentage of that?
Oh, it's very small. And the reason it's very small is that they say they don't have enough money to build them. Remember, nuclear power stations are very like renewables. That is, you need a lot of money up front. Whether it's a nuclear power station or a wind farm, the money has to be up front to build it. Now, there is another possible route, but that's going to come in later on, using not uranium but using thorium as the fuel. Oddly enough, some of the early reactors built after the Manhattan Project were fueled with thorium. The advantage of thorium is A, there's 7 times as much of it as plutonium, and secondly, you would find it very, very difficult to make a weapon using thorium, whereas uranium produces plutonium. And in fact, that's why these reactors were developed in the first place. They were developed to produce plutonium, and the electricity was a byproduct. Now, the whole thing has been messed up by the government. 2003, we had a white paper saying that we didn't need nuclear power and everything can be done in other ways. 2006, we had another white paper saying nuclear power was essential. 2008, we actually had a white paper on nuclear saying that we needed, there would be 8 new nuclear sites and we would need to develop eventually perhaps up to 40 new nuclear power stations. If you're somebody that has to invest in nuclear power stations or wind generators or whatever, that's not very helpful if the government keeps changing its mind. But we've run into a bigger problem as far as finance is concerned. As you know, after the Fukushima accident, Angela Merkel and her cabinet, who only 3 years before had said that nuclear power was essential in Germany, now said, no, we're going to pull out of nuclear and close down the nuclear stations. The effect has been on the 2 big German companies, E.ON and RWE. Well, RWE is well on the way to going bust, in fact, and is short of, I forgot what the last month it was, 25 million or something like that. E.ON the same. They both had to get rid of thousands of people, and the money flowing in, that would have flown in from the nuclear stations, is now not going to because they're being closed down. So this presents a real problem. Now, the green movement has not been much help as far as development of nuclear is concerned. But what is interesting, as a result of sensible analysis, is that a whole lot of the green movement people have all recanted. Just to give you some idea, Patrick Moore, founder of Greenpeace, Stuart Brand, who produced the Whole Earth catalogue, George Monbiot, who writes in The Guardian, Lord Smith, chair of the Environmental Agency, Baroness Worthington, all people who are thoroughly opposed to nuclear power, now look into their television sets and say to the country, oh, mea culpa, we're very sorry, we got it all wrong. Had Tom Burke been here today, I would have asked him if he was going to recant, but I don't expect he would. Anyway, there's been a movement in the right direction, in my view, except that all the opposition to nuclear power in this country, much of it demonised by the press, unfortunately, has held progress up, for the last 10 years, for longer than that. The result is that now we have a decade with real problems, the prospect of shortage of electricity power generation and not being able to meet our CO2 targets, which nuclear can't possibly fill, because the first nuclear station we can have up and running will be, well, they say 2019, I think it'll be 2020. And then we may have as many as 8 by 2025. And so that's why I say, yes, nuclear power can't entirely plug the gap, it can make a large difference. But because it's been held up by wittering and government foolishness and so on, then we're 10 years behindhand, and which is a pity. Now, one way of helping to resolve the problem, although it's not going to be resolved, the programme up to 2020 is going to be resolved by burning gas. We talk about it and all the rest of it. That's the only way of doing it. The only new power stations being built at the moment are gas-fired power stations. I was at a meeting in Brussels with, amongst others, the chairman of Gazprom, and he said, natural gas is the new renewable, he said, we'll sell you as much as you want, and that's going to be the way ahead. And too many government ministers have clutched onto this and said, well, there we are. And then there's lots more gas, shale gas, they say, which I think you have to view with great caution. But that's what's going to happen over the next 20 years. We'll gradually build up more renewables, more very expensive renewables, as you appreciate. But it's a terrifying prospect if we really start to run out of fuel. Just one little thing on the costs of nuclear. People endlessly say it's too expensive to contemplate. Now, over the last 5 years, there have been 4 or 5 really important reports produced by people with no particular vested interests in this country, by the Royal Academy of Engineering and PB Power in Switzerland, by the, what's the Paul Scherrer, I've forgotten the name of the institute now, but and OECD and others. And I know many of you won't believe this, but as far as the overall costs, levelized costs, for all the different ways of generating electricity, nuclear power is the cheapest. Finishes up with a cost of about £65 a megawatt hour. Offshore wind, to give you some sort of idea, is about 106, nearly twice as much. And oddly enough, coal with carbon capture, which we heard about again, and they just re-announced the carbon capture program, then that comes to about £95 a megawatt hour. Putting carbon capture and storage onto a coal-fired station just about doubles the cost of the electricity generated. And so, I suppose my final point is, all the things that we're contemplating doing to reduce CO2 are all very expensive, and they all have to be very heavily subsidised, and the cost of energy goes up and up and up. So that's a very serious, that's the next political hot potato that the government is going to have to deal with. I know that a lot of people are enthusiastic at the moment about putting solar panels on roofs and windmills and things locally. And a point I sometimes make is, and it's subsidised of course by you and me. I think about £100 a year goes on all our electricity bills at the moment to subsidise things like solar and wave power and all those things. And so you put up solar panels. It's still a sensible thing to put solar panels on the roof in energy saving terms and all the rest of it. But the only people that can afford to do it are nice middle class people with spare capital. But everybody subsidises it. And in fact, all of you that have put solar panels and things on your roofs are being subsidised by the poor who cannot possibly do that. But it all goes onto their electricity bills. So it's socially a very unacceptable situation. I had to explain it once to some quite senior people, and it had never crossed their minds because they were all boasting about what they were doing. In terms of storage of waste, we'll hear more about that from Gordon in a minute or two. One thing to say though, we have stored radioactive waste safely for 50 years now, and he knows all about it. And the conclusion that the Finns have come to, incidentally, is deep geological storage is the way ahead. And of course, they've actually got round to doing it. And Gordon will correct me if I've got it wrong, I think that's the conclusion that his committee came to in the end. People go on about it and say we shouldn't use nuclear power because we don't know what to do with the waste. We do know what to do with the waste. And secondly, it's like saying, stop the world, I want to get off. We've been in the nuclear business for 50 years. We have waste, though incidentally, all the high-level waste that we've generated over those 50 years could be accommodated on St James's Park football pitch. We're not talking about, probably a good thing too if we did do that, or perhaps Arsenal's pitch, I don't know. But it can be done, and that's an important side of it all. And as far as safety is concerned, again, if you look at the statistics for deaths per megawatt hour, the one right at the bottom of the scale is nuclear power. And the worst is hydro, by a long way. That's because dams burst. And the second worst is coal. And so if you think nuclear is dangerous, just reflect that pollution from coal-fired power stations causing heart attacks and pulmonary problems and all the rest of it. Number of deaths last year was 14,000. Number of deaths from civil nuclear power, 0. So there may be other emotional reasons for not wanting to use nuclear power, but as far as I'm concerned, logically, If we don't go down the nuclear route, then we really are in trouble. I'll stop there, Chairman, wherever he's gone to. Oh, there he is.
Thank you.